This is Daniel Simon at Baton Rouge Community College. This is my history podcast for the week on the Napoleonic Age. Welcome, class. How's it going? Now, today we're going to be talking about, of course, the rise of Napoleon in the Napoleonic Age. Now, we've already covered in our History 1123 class, we've already covered a lot of the early rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, mostly the first 20, 30 years of his life. So we have covered like the background Napoleon, dealing with him being born on Corsica. We talked about his early life, um, him attending French schools like the École Militaire. He attended in his youth. Then after that, we talked about his nicknames: Little Corporal, they call or Little Emperor. We talked about his height, probably about 5'6", which is about average height for those days. Now it's kind of more shorter today. And we talked about his early life, like he had two wives, of course. Married Josephine de Beauharnais in 1796. That was his first Empress consort. And then, of course, he had also his second wife later, which is Marie Louise, who was Austrian. We also talked about his early campaigns. His first early campaign was the one where he fought the Austrians and also Piedmont, I believe it was, in northern Italy, so-called Italian campaign, which made him famous. That's where he got his name, the Little Corporal. He even, after he defeated the Austrians in Italy and Austria, he even formalized the actual treaty which ended the war, which is the Treaty of Campo Formio. So he was kind of being a statesman there, doing that as well. And Italy after that is controlled a lot by the French. Now we haven't talked about, after the first coalition kind of dissolves, the French are still fighting the British in 1797-98. So what the French decided to do under Napoleon, they decided to attack Egypt. So that leads to the strange campaign of the Egyptian campaign. It's one of the weird aspects of Napoleon's military career. So with an expedition of about 40,000 troops, Napoleon invaded Egypt with his navy. They were fighting not really the Turks, but the Mamluks. The Mamluks were these mercenaries of the Turks, which were kind of a mix of peoples like Arab and so on. And they were kind of like slave mercenaries or slave soldiers. He landed his force there in May 1798, easily took Alexandria, and then marched his forces down the Nile River to where Cairo is. And that's when he fought the Mamluks in a battle, which is called the Battle of the Pyramids, fought on July 21st, 1798. And Napoleon routed their forces with very few casualties, easily took control of Egypt. While the French occupied Egypt, they made reforms to Egypt. They also brought in scientists like to study Egypt. Scientists, artists, engineers were very interested in ancient Egypt. They thought there were a lot of mysteries about Egypt that people didn't really know about in modern times. And there was a soldier named Pierre Bouchard. He found a huge half-ton stone, later called the Rosetta Stone, in a fort in Rosetta, which is in the Nile Delta, and proved to be pretty important. The actual Rosetta Stone was the stone inscription from the reign of King Ptolemy V. That's the Ptolemaic dynasty, and listed like a coronation of his reign. It was written in 3 languages, which you can see were Greek, hieroglyphics, and Demotic, which Demotic was a type of cursive hieroglyphs. It proved to be pretty important because it led to the translation of hieroglyphs. And so in a sense, Napoleon helped start, modern Egyptology. The guy at first they think started was Jean-Francois Champollion. He was a cryptologist that translated the actual Rosetta Stone in the 1820s. And that led to us knowing more about later Egypt, ancient Egypt, from a long time ago. Napoleon's Egyptian campaign didn't go well. If you know about what happened, his fleet was sunk, and the British under Lord Horatio Nelson, one of the greatest naval commanders of the whole Napoleonic Wars, found the French fleet docked in Albuquerque Bay, August 1798. That led to the Battle of either the Nile, they call it, or also called the Battle of Albuquerque Bay. And his fleet was mostly destroyed. It left Napoleon's army trapped in Egypt for about a year or so. And Napoleon's forces did try to invade where Palestine is to fight the Mamluks, Turks forces there. And it was somewhat successful, but he wasn't able to seize really control of Accra, which is in northern Israel. And eventually his troops got bubonic plague. Yeah, they did. It riddled with it. And so they were forced to retreat back to Egypt. And from there, he was stuck there until he left. And he went back to France after that. And even though he hadn't done that great in Egypt, he was still seen as a hero. Because, people idolized Napoleon. And he also was very good at using propaganda, Napoleon. So from there, he was able to overthrow the Directory in November 1799. It was often called the coup of 18 Brumaire. Happened really on November 9th, 1799. And the coup was backed by a bunch of officials in the Directory like Abbe Sieyès, Paul Barras, we mentioned before. I think two of Napoleon's brothers were involved in it. Of course, the military was too, because of Napoleon being one of the top generals. And so he was able to overthrow it. And they think effectively that ended the French Revolution, in 1799 when he took over. So that began the age of Napoleon at that point. Napoleon dominates, France and Europe for the next, 15 years or so. And usually in the Napoleonic Age is divided into two periods. It goes from 1799 to 1815, but they have the consulate, which is first, and then you have the Napoleonic Empire, which is called different names. Some people call it the First French Empire. Others call it the Grand Empire, which Napoleon liked the word grand a lot, which meant great empire of Napoleon. The consulate was almost like a dictatorship, but it was a republican French state where Napoleon basically controlled it. And he ruled as first consul of the French Republic. He even helped draw up the actual Constitution in 1799, which was called the Constitution of the Year 8. Basically, he controlled the state and began making reforms. And a lot of the states that were around France didn't like Napoleon. They would continue a lot of the wars against him. Yeah, there was a second coalition. The British formed that one, which included Britain, Austria, Russia were mostly in it. And they fought a brief war. It was like one of the shortest, I think, coalitions they had, except I want to say the fifth one was also shorter too. And they had one big battle Napoleon fought that was famous called the Battle of Marengo. That was considered one of Napoleon's famous battles. He fought the Austrians in northern Italy in the Alps. That's when they make paintings of Napoleon like riding horses in the Alps and all that. And he defeated them on June 14th, 1800. With that decisive victory, he still controlled Italy at that point. And the British signed a treaty with him called the Treaty of Amiens, which is the only peaceful period after the whole period, because Napoleonic Wars later are just bloody that last 10 years or so. Napoleon was actually made consul for life at one point in 1802, but in 1804 he was made emperor of France. In France they actually had a plebiscite where everybody voted unanimously for him as emperor. And he was crowned on December 2nd, 1804 in Notre Dame Cathedral, which is in Paris, France. That's the cathedral, that famously burned last year. And the crowning is famous because the Pope was there. I think it was Pope Pius VII, I believe it is. And the Pope went to put the crown on, Napoleon's head, and he grabbed the crown and put it on his own head, and he crowned his own wife, Josephine, as his empress consort, which shocked a lot of people. It was all planned, actually. And so he becomes emperor, and so that begins the whole Napoleonic Empire, which will last till 1814, 1815. Now, Napoleon was known for making a lot of reforms to the country. Now, these are reform. He wasn't just this king or ruler, emperor that reigns over the French. He was known as a politician and reformer. You can see a few things he did in the lecture notes. He balanced the budget, which they hadn't done in years. He founded a modern bank, Banque de France, which is still around. It's like a French corporation now, which was started by Swiss bankers around 1800. It's the bank that pretty much bankrolled him, and put him in power. Napoleon brought the nobility back. So these are some social things he did. Although the bourgeoisie, upper middle class, still retained a lot of the power as well. He started a French civil service system, which was based on merit. You can see he also created the Legion of Honor, which was a French merit system for the military and civil employees, and not just French anymore. I think pretty much anybody can be given that reward now. You can see the order had five different distinct degrees: knight, officer, commander, grand officer, and grand master, which the President Macron has that title. They had a motto too. You can see honor and fatherland. There's like different medals for different ranks. They even had cash rewards. The biggest medal you could get was the Grand Cross. That's the one that Napoleon often wears in a lot of paintings, if you see. Religious order. They brought the Catholic Church back. The Concordat of 1801 was this agreement they made with Pope Pius VII of the Catholic Church. It wasn't the only religion, but it became the main religion again. They allowed other religions too, like Protestantism, Judaism. Of course, I told you, Napoleon's not really that religious of a guy. He pretty much was somewhat secular. He realized people need religion, and that old pagan stuff they were doing. Remember under Robespierre, that deist cult, whatever. That they did away with that, Anyway, the clergy were allowed to return. A lot of the clergy were kind of loyal to the state, or had to be, and they secularized a lot of differences between the church and the state. Like if you got married, you had to have you could have a religious service, but you still had to have a state one too, and all that. So that's what the Concordat of 1801 was. Of course, his most famous thing that he did was the Civil Code of 1804, also called the Napoleonic Code or Code Napoleon. This was a famous civil law code system that the French developed under Napoleon. It was developed by various jurists. The code was heavily influenced by the French Revolution, but it was also, you can see, influenced by the Justinian Code, which was developed in the 6th century by Emperor Justinian of the Byzantines. It started under the French consulate and spread to other countries in Europe. A lot of other European countries, a lot of their law code systems are based on it. Louisiana's law code system is also based on the Napoleonic Code. I've got examples of the code that exists that are famous. You can see that it gave all males equality. Of course, it did not include women. Women did not really have any equal rights till later. You don't really see that until early 20th century. Later, they'll have the right to vote too, universal later. Established a private bank, which the Banque de France, is pretty much created from that. Strengthened the French bureaucracy, you can see, throughout France, which appointed mayors and so on. Religious freedom was included in it too, which was, going back to the Concordat of 1801. Everything was based on merit, like if you were in the military or a civil servant in the government and all that. That's pretty much was made legal too as well there. Napoleon he censored certain things, like censorship was big under him. He was known for using a lot of propaganda. And Napoleon was one of the first to develop a secret police. They had a French secret police which spied on people and stuff like that, and he was kind of notorious for that. Yeah, I just said about women's rights. Women's rights were, like I said, limited under the code. But it did create a strong central government. That's one thing about the code. However, if you know about it, Napoleon was kind of above the code. That's the one thing about it. But that's another story. Yeah, and of course, Napoleon said a famous quote he said about it. He said, interesting quote I've gotten in the notes. It says, if there are problems with a government that is too strong, then there are many problems with a government that is too weak. Things don't work unless you break the law every day. So you realize they needed some kind of law code system, I guess, to prevent anarchy like had happened during the French Revolution, and all that. Right, then we got the Napoleonic Wars, which peak around 1805 to 1814, 15. These are the most famous aspects that happened during the Napoleonic Wars. During this period, Napoleon would create a vast empire which would take over most of Europe, like Spain, France, all the way to what is Poland. Besides trying to modernize France, he would try to spread a lot of the ideals, like we talked about before. A lot of people didn't like Napoleon. They thought he was this dictator. The British called him Old Boney and all this. So it sparked a series of wars in Europe, which started around 1804, 1805, and it led to a lot of deaths. You can see 3 million people were killed during the Napoleonic Wars. They were some of the bloodiest wars. You have to go all the way back to the 30 Years' War to get a bloodier war than that. And then you won't have a bloodier war until like this series of wars until World War I. Now, there was different coalitions that formed against Napoleon. A lot of the wars were like war of coalitions that were stacked against him. Most of them were backed by Britain. They were the ones bankrolling most of the coalitions. Britain was the main one. The other ones were Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden fought in some other countries, Spain, so on. They were kind of minor. They were in the war. The third and fourth coalitions mostly pitted like Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria the most in those wars. Now, the War of the Third Coalition, that happened 1805 to 1806. Napoleon was wanting to invade Britain. He wasn't able to cross the English Channel and all that. So Napoleon decided to take his armies and attack Austria and other powers in Europe. So he formed the Grand Army, which formed in 1804. The Grand Army was Napoleon's Great Army, as they called it. This was his main army that fought in the Napoleonic Wars. It's considered one of the first modernized armies that fought in the world, especially in Europe. It was founded in 1804. It got almost to 1 million troops. It's 800,000, maybe larger than that at one point in it. It did, you see, create the whole corps system that they have in armies now today. They even created like ranks of soldiers, and they would put like ranks on their shoulders and stuff like that. And the army was bad. For a bunch of years, nobody could beat it. Their artillery was ridiculous. They just clobbered people. And anyway, the first series of wars, they fought the Austrians and Russians in 1805, 1806. They had the Battle of Ulm, and Napoleon's forces crossed the Rhine River into Austria. So-called Ulm campaign, they called it. And he just obliterated their forces at the Battle of Ulm in October 1805. And the Austrians actually surrendered 60,000 troops. And Napoleon marched on Vienna, took their capital, and was basically sleeping in the Schönbrunn Palace. So he basically took it over at that point. From there, the Russians in the east decided to combine forces with the Austrians, thinking they had a better chance to defeat Napoleon's forces. So that led to the Battle of Austerlitz, which Austerlitz was a famous battle of Napoleon's, one of his greatest victories that was fought It's now what it's called the Czech Republic. And at the time, it was part of the Austrian, like they're part of their empire. And it pitted two different armies. They were kind of similar size. Napoleon's army had 70-some thousand troops. So did the uh, Austro-Russian forces as well. And they were led by different rulers. Russia was led by Emperor Alexander I, their Tsar, and then you had Holy Roman Emperor was France II, and the two combined their forces, but it wasn't enough. They got beat bad, and eventually Napoleon's forces routed them, like in a attack up the center of their forces, and the Russian Austrian force lost 2/3 of their forces. You can see in the stats there, they 30,000 were captured, and then about almost 30,000 were killed and wounded. It's ridiculous, that battle. It really cemented Napoleon as a military genius because a lot of people have studied that battle and all that. Treaty of Pressburg ended the war. You can see it ceded vast territories to Napoleon, which included the Netherlands and Italy. Bavaria even, of course, became a kingdom after that. Third coalition collapsed, and one of the big things that happened after that was the Holy Roman Empire collapsed. It was gone. Napoleon dissolved it, pretty much. So Emperor Francis, he became the Emperor of Austria, and they later do call him sometimes Francis the First instead of Francis II, usually. He started setting up all these little satellite states everywhere. There was one called the Confederation of the Rhine that was created after that Third Coalition War. And that was like this buffer state that was created between Italy and Germany. He created these everywhere, all these states, and he put like rulers on different of these different thrones, which probably was known for a lot of nepotism, put a lot of his relatives on thrones and all that. Then you had the War of the Fourth Coalition that came next. What happened was Napoleon then invaded Prussia to the north and trying to knock them out of the coalitions. And he had fought two battles, which were simultaneous at the same time. October 14, 1806, the Battle of Jena and also Arstedt. Well, in October 1806, you can see. October 14th, yeah. And that was a lopsided battle. The Prussians just weren't very good. And their forces were annihilated, practically. 40,000 killed, wounded, 120,000 were captured by Napoleon's forces. He took Berlin too. Took their capital as well. Then from Prussia, Napoleon then pushed eastward, like into East Prussia and Poland. He took on the Russian forces under Alexander I again. And again, they were wiped out too. They didn't have much of a chance either in that battle. And that happened in June 1807. The Russians were defeated and knocked out of the war too, pretty much. So yeah, these wars of the Third Coalition, Fourth Coalition, they were like a few months and it was over. So the Grand Army was just, it was unbeatable at that point. Then they had the Peace of Tilsit, June 26, 1807. Napoleon's forces then forced Alexander I under Russia and also the Prussians to sue for peace. It was actually two treaties with Russia and Prussia. And in this agreement, what happened was it allowed Napoleon to basically take over Europe all the way to Poland at this point. Russia was given its sphere of influence in the East, like Eastern Europe, to deal with maybe the Ottoman Empire, basically. Napoleon created this buffer state called the Grand Duchy of Warsaw at that point. This was like this Polish state at this point that Napoleon thought was needed because Poland had been partitioned in the late 18th century. And so he put that there. It's kind of a buffer between Russia and, I guess, Germany, and more in the west, right there. He also created the Kingdom of Westphalia. I don't know if you have to know about that. He put one of his brothers on the throne, King of Westphalia, though. I think Danzig became a free city in northern Poland, which it was for years. after that. One more thing, of course, I'll talk about in this podcast, and I'll take a break. We Battle of Trafalgar, of course, the only battle that Napoleon lost during this period. It was a naval battle, fought off the coast of Spain, near the Cape of Trafalgar, it's called, and that was a naval battle where Napoleon's forces, Napoleon had combined the French and the Spanish fleets at the time, and he was going to try to maybe invade Britain, and the British naval forces defeated Napoleon's navy, almost wiped out most of their fleet. I think they took out, looks like, I forget how many they took out, almost 30 ships or whatever it was. And that was really the greatest naval battle, really, of the whole Napoleonic Wars. Lord Nelson, of course, led the fleet. His famous flagship you may have heard of was called, I think it was called HMS Victory, is what it's called. He was actually killed in the battle. He became kind of idolized and immortalized later, about Lord Nelson. And really, Napoleon never really threatened the British naval-wise. The French just didn't have a navy much of anything. And so it was like, Sparta versus Athens, in the Peloponnesian War. They couldn't really do anything naval-wise against the British. And they think that's part of why Britain was such a thorn in the side of the French Napoleonic Wars. So at this point, Britain's the only country really fighting. Everybody else is, knocked out of the war at this point. And I'm going to talk about later, take a break here, and with another podcast in a second, but we'll talk about what happens with Napoleon's empire. It collapses, and then basically we'll see about post-Napoleon Europe after that.